French history in a global frame. I'm going to be our moderator today. So I just want to set some things up for you, and then we'll get to introductions and right on into our content. The goal of this session is really just to share some strategies, right? How things that we can all do as we teach or learn about French history that really help fit French events and phenomena into larger world historical patterns. Now, this panel was originally intended to function as a real roundtable, and we wanted a lot of interaction with our audience. We were all sort of craving as much input as we had things to say, or even more so. So we're going to try to recreate this as much as possible. One thing we're going to do is launch a series of 3 polls throughout our session today. And so I'm going to ask our our host, David, to actually launch our first poll. We just sort of want to get a sense from all of you, you should see it now on your screen, for the way that the French history courses that you teach or the ones you've taken, how much they've included global and imperial themes. So thank you. We'll have those results momentarily. But as we're waiting for those, I just want to let you know that we're also soliciting questions and comments throughout. We're going to plan to do some brief introductions, have some brief opening statements. We have a few questions we want to talk through a little bit. But at any point, you should feel free to ask a question or make a comment. There's 2 ways you can do that. The first is everything's going to go through the chat function. Just put that out there. So everything goes through the chat function. You're going to want to contact the host, that's France. You can either submit the question in the chat function, and David will make sure that I get it and I can read those off, and I'll try to group them together if we have quite a lot. Your other option, if you're willing to come on screen with us, your other option is to ask your question or to write to France and say, hey, I have a question or comment that I'd like to make on screen. They will do a really quick identity check for you just to make sure, and then you'll just wait for me to invite you on. I will let David know when to unmute you. So those are the basic rules. Quick poll results. So it looks like the majority, sort of the biggest answer, right? Almost 50% of folks say less than half of you have have global themes in your courses, and the rest are pretty well. So hopefully, again, you'll have a lot to contribute to our discussion. Okay. Who are we? So I'm Melissa Byrnes. I'm an associate professor of history at Southwestern University. Most of my research is on race, migration, empire, activism, and human rights. And Darcie needs to unmute.
Okay, sorry about that. I had a lot of Florida atmospheric noise and leaf blowers around me, so I had to mute quickly. I'm Darcie Fontaine. I am an associate professor at the University of South Florida. Most of my work so far has been on colonization and decolonization of Algeria.
Am I next?
Yeah, you're on.
So I'm Roxanne Panchasi, and I'm an associate professor of history at Salon University. My institution has 3 campuses, and the 2 where I typically teach are located on the traditional unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam First Nations. Unceded means these territories were never relinquished, surrendered. Can you all hear me over this truck? They were never relinquished, surrendered, or given away in any form. And these lands are known as the cities of Burnaby and Vancouver in the province called British Columbia, in the country that most of you will know, and that I also call regularly Canada. So I wrote a book about a decade ago about the future and anticipation between the wars. I've written other things on war, film, memory, French culture, broadly speaking, and I'm currently working on a project on French nuclear weapons and testing in Algeria and the Pacific since the early 1990s.
Jen?
All right, I'm Jennifer Sessions. I am a professor of history at the University of Virginia, where I work mostly on French relations with Algeria, history of French settler colonialism in North Africa. I teach courses in French history, European history, history of imperialism and colonialism. And yes, I'm very excited to be there. I should say that I'm speaking from Buffalo, New York, rather than from Charlottesville. And so I will apologize if there's any thunderstorm noise that comes in through my window.
Fantastic. All right, so that's who we are. We all just wanted to give you a kind of a brief opening, some of where we come from for this topic. Again, just sort of letting you know some of what we've been thinking about before we start to get into conversation. So I'm mostly going to be talking about my experience teaching what was actually the very first French history class I taught and designed on my own, and I did it from the very beginning with the intention of having a lot of global and imperial themes. That was sort of, I originally called it like the ins and outs of history. I've called it inside out. I've called it a few things. It's now my modern France and Empire class. And I really wanted, what I really hoped for students and what I really wanted, sort of the main learning goal here was to get them familiar with French history, yes, right, conversant with major themes, major events, things that, you know, got us all into the French history world. But I really wanted to get them to recognize the historical and historiographical limits of national borders in this. And I wanted to expand the way they understood Frenchness in particular, really calling into question their assumption of sort of a uniform Frenchness or the whiteness of Frenchness. And I really wanted to have them embed their idea of what is French into a much richer tapestry of human history. And I should mention that I actually wrote about the very first iteration of this course in a World History Bulletin in winter of 2010. It was a special issue called France and World History. It was edited by Michael Vann and Alyssa Sepinwall, and it's still available online as a resource for us. And I believe we are going to be collecting a set of resources through this that we're going to share with folks somehow later on. So one of the advantages I had with this class is, as I mentioned, I actually started off to make sure that it was essentially half and half within the hexagon, half outside in some ways. I think important context here, Southwestern University is a small liberal arts college. I'm in a really small department, and we all have to do a lot of reaching sort of outside of our comfort zones. And one of the things that at least I'm lucky to benefit from is that all of my colleagues are also really committed to global and transnational and transregional history. And so I get a lot of support, and I think that is important to recognize. That some of us have more support in this endeavor than others do. But when it comes to the course itself, I think, you know, obvious place to start a course like this is with the revolutions, right? Talking about the French Revolution, talking about the Haitian Revolution. And so we spend a week on each, equal time for France and Haiti. And I think that this pairing and the actual spending of the same amount of time in both of these, you know, it ensures that the Haitian Revolution really gets its, proper billing as a major world historical event, but it also gets students really thinking about the transatlantic connections, right? How ideas and people are moving in both directions, how Haitians are launching fundamental critiques of the French system and its values, how Haitians are interpreting and laying claim to ideas of liberty, and then how we have multiple French reactions to all of these Haitian claims. So that's where we just start right off from the beginning, kind of following up on that. When we talk about Napoleon, we spend half the time looking at European campaigns, mostly in Italy, and then we look at Egypt. And here I love assigning Aljabarti's Chronicle of the French Occupation. He really opens up some excellent questions about how the French revolutionary ideals are translated and understood. So this is a great follow-up to Haiti and our discussion of Haitian revolutionaries. And it really primes students to start thinking about the types of voices and the types of experiences that we're missing from a lot of other histories of colonization. Over the years, I've had more and more students come in on that day and be like, wow, we're not used to hearing the folks who are being invaded actually talking back. And so they really enjoy Aljabarti for that. But one of the things we wanted to make sure we talked about today is the ways that there are also non-imperial global connections. And I think one of the places that this works best in the course that I teach is actually when we do the Dreyfus Affair. So we spend the first half of the week looking at exactly sort of the French experiences, how French politics and culture and society are refracted through the experience of the Dreyfus Affair. But then we look at sort of foreign reactions, the perceptions of France are changing through the way people are witnessing this, looking especially at the work of foreign correspondents, because it's some of the easiest in terms of source material to get to. And that even though we don't have a lot of time to talk about it, if we're talking about journalists during the Dreyfus Affair, we kind of have to think about the fact, okay, that's where Theodor Herzl is at this point in time. This is where he starts to really have his notion for the creation of a Jewish state, founding of Zionism, eventually the creation of the state of Israel. So kind of seeing the way this ripples out quite broadly into things that they're going to recognize. And then given some of my current interests, and I'll just plug that my research presentation next week talks about this, 1968, I think, is another really wonderful moment to consider the ways that events that are sort of classically defined through a narrow lens of Paris and Mai Juin, how these are deeply transnational, right? They're part of international solidarity movements. They're being influenced by a global set of ideas. They are furthered and reinterpreted in so many places for so many years after. Ultimately, what I argue, or what I would sort of say for all of us, is that I think we can only really understand French history when we start to weave it back into the world. I think that there's a new clarity for myself, certainly for my students. There's a new clarity in the way that we understand the canon, the way we understand the traditional, the classical chronology. If we break these open, if we add other voices, if we start to look at sort of off moments, maybe, if we start to trace connections and influences. And I think one of the things we manage to do for that and for our students is that we start to listen to way historical actors experienced all of these things together, right? They're not blocking things off. They sort of know what's going on in their world, just the way that we and our students do. And with that, I will turn things over to Darcie.
Okay, thank you so much, Melissa. So I, much like Melissa, started teaching my French history course at the University of South Florida in a global framework, in part because that was how I was trained to think about French history. I was probably somewhat unusual in that I never really took a formal French history course as a student. And when I was in graduate school, I was very much trained as a global and comparative historian, women's and gender history, everything, even my European history training at Rutgers was very much thinking in a transnational framework and thinking about empires and so forth. So when I got to USF in 2011 and started teaching French history, it was already kind of in my natural capacity to think about it within a global framework. Additionally, USF, University of South Florida in Tampa, where I teach, is an urban public university with about 50,000 students, many of whom are not born in the United States or their parents are immigrants. We have a large Haitian, Caribbean student population, as well as students from really all over the world, Middle East, South Asia. And while some of them are interested in European history, what really attracts them are things that are connected to their own interests and life experiences. So when they're interested in a French history course, they want to talk about the Haitian Revolution. They want to talk about things that are connected to their lives or to their histories, their own histories. So that in some ways is a compelling case for why it's important for me in particular to think about teaching French history in a global framework. I also teach a lot of education majors who need this course and other European history courses to pass content licensing exams. So the more global I can make it also, the better. So one of the things that I'm also want to talk about is a little bit is textbooks, in part because I've just written one, but also the reason that I wrote it in part was because my course starts in the 18th century. And one of the things that happened when I started teaching this course was that there really were no textbooks that worked for my course because I was teaching it in a global framework. The one that existed at the time was Alice Conklin, Sarah Fishman, Robert Zaretsky's book, France and its Empire Since 1870. I think that's what it's called. But when you start in the 18th century, a book that begins in 1870 is kind of not ideal. And I ended up being approached by Routledge in 2014. They asked me if I would be willing to write a textbook that dealt with France and the world to fit into their series on European countries in a global context. And at the time, I jumped at the opportunity, having little clue what it would entail, thinking it would be pretty simple, it'd be fine. I kind of knew how to do it. And in the end, I was completely wrong because it was by far the most challenging thing I've ever done. 6 years later, I finally finished a draft of the manuscript and then I'm revising. It's under review right now. It was really an enormously challenging project to think about how to write a narrative that's really inclusive of France and the world in all these kind of ideal ways. So when I was thinking about what an ideal textbook that would be global France in the world, include empire, there were several things that I wanted to address. I wanted to create a narrative that wouldn't necessarily be tied to the concept of republicanism that in some ways seems to foreclose other ways of thinking about global connections with France and the empire. I wanted to fully incorporate the empire into the metropolitan narrative as seamlessly as possible to avoid just having kind of a section at the end that dealt with events in the empire. And this includes integrating Algeria and the Dom-Tom, Antilles in particular, as part of the French history narrative and not really relegating it to what seems like a separate part of every chapter or even separate chapters or even somewhat seems like a different book. I also wanted to not be timid about addressing race, slavery, colonial violence and its consequences in all of its different contexts, including post-colonial. I wanted women and gender to not be afterthoughts, stuck in as case studies or examples, but to be fully integrated and natural part of the narrative. I wanted to very ambitiously integrate cultural history, social, intellectual history, and not just kind of focus on political history narratives. And finally, I wanted to consider France's relationship with the world, not just as a question of empire, but more complex interactions and legacies that can help us think beyond France as well. As Melissa talked about, like it's important to think about things like the Dreyfus Affair and other interactions that happen, not just in the imperial context. So obviously this is very ambitious, kind of impossible maybe to get everything into one textbook, but as I'm revising and kind of streamlining these narratives, I'm trying to adhere as closely as possible to all of these goals. Obviously this won't work as a textbook for everyone, but I think if you're trying to think, in my case, in how to build a global history textbook, how to be as inclusive in the idea of what is French history, what can French history be, then hopefully this is something that might be useful for people who are interested in teaching a global French history course. And in particular, in thinking, one last thing I want to say, as French historians, we're always being encouraged to try and get out into the public sphere. And I think probably one of the best ways we can do that is in working with curriculum, working with secondary school teachers, building sources, because as I've been working a lot with AP history and working with secondary school teachers, this is one of the best ways that these more inclusive narratives actually get out into the public sphere. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about textbooks, how useful they are, what we can do with them a little bit later, but just wanted to kind of throw that out there. And I'll send it now to Roxanne.
Thanks, Darcie. I do really apologize for all of these crazy sirens. My apartment is one where it seems like Vancouver is constantly on fire. So in my self-introduction earlier, I probably noticed it took me a while to make that introduction because I began by acknowledging the land where I'm zooming in from, or at least the land that my university's campuses are on, which for the downtown campus of my institution is the same acknowledgement as that I would give for where I am right now, the part of Vancouver where I'm sitting right now. So I am a settler, an uninvited guest on this territory, the child of parents who immigrated to Canada from India in the late 1960s. I guess, oh, the poll is popping up now. So yeah, you'll see on the, I was gonna announce this later, but you'll see on the screen a poll that asks about your experience with land acknowledgement at your institution. So if you can just fill that one out, I'll come back to it a little bit later. So yeah, I was born here a couple of years after my parents' arrival in the late 1960s from India. I acknowledged this place at the beginning of this presentation, roundtable, and its peoples, as I would as a matter of course at any event. And I know that some of you in various places in North America probably also do this. I guess I'll find out from the poll results. And originally when I was planning on giving this or participating in this roundtable in New Zealand, I thought, what an ideal place to have this conversation about settler colonialism and teaching French history, global history, and imperial history. So I'm hoping there's some New Zealanders in the audience for discussion and who will be answering that poll too. In the past few years, I have also started doing a land acknowledgement at the beginning of my French history courses. Well, all of my history courses, but for these purposes, for us today, my French history courses. Most recently, I taught a summer course on France and World War II entirely remotely, and I included an acknowledgement on the front page of our course website in our learning management system, and did a verbal acknowledgement during our first synchronous class session on Zoom. So for me, land acknowledgement in my teaching and beyond has become one important way that I recognize my own presence, my daily life, and privileges in relationship to a long history of colonialism in this place that was home to indigenous people for centuries before Europeans and others arrived, and is still home to their descendants. So land acknowledgement for me is one of the meaningful strategies that I use to connect the work that I do as a settler scholar living in this place we call Vancouver, researching and teaching, usually about France, Europe, and empires in the modern period. So connecting those things to this place where my students are going about living and learning together. And I should just note here that a very small minority of my students are typically identify as Indigenous. It's just under 6%, I think, of the population is Indigenous in British Columbia, the province where I live. And it's less than this, much less for this in Vancouver, in the cities and surrounding area. So I don't know if people have completed that poll, but I guess I'll wait for those results to come back to it. So I just wanted to say that when I first got here to Vancouver and to SFU, almost 20 years ago now, I'm not land acknowledgement. And this changed over the years as I spent more time engaged with the broader community and sites where people were more attuned to Indigenous history and contemporary issues. It's also changed quite dramatically over the past several years in response to the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada that ran its course from 2008 to 2015, and an ongoing process since 2015 when the TRC closed here to develop meaningful responses to its recommendations at my own institution and beyond. So when land acknowledgements became more common, I certainly respected them and recognized their importance, but it took me a while to realize how important it is for me to do them in the context of teaching modern French history. At first, like a lot of people, I think, I was uncomfortable and reluctant, like a lot of settlers in particular, because I'm not from British Columbia. I wasn't familiar with the history of this place. Canada is really big and the regions are very different, and the way we're taught history in elementary school and high school is very different. I was taught almost no Indigenous history. And then I went to graduate school in the United States and spent years in France. So I didn't really know the history of this place when I moved here. And it's taken me a long time to understand key aspects of that history, and I still have so much to learn. And then when it came to my French history classes, I thought at first, like, that's not what this course is about. I don't do Canadian history. What's the connection? How am I going to make this something other than a pro forma thing, which is sometimes how that happens. The best practice here is to really try to say something meaningful about why you're doing the acknowledgement, not to just do an acknowledgement as a kind of rubber stamping of an event or an occasion. So when I think about it, I'm frankly embarrassed by what historical Roxanne did and thought when I talk about this now, because now it seems like such a productive thing to draw attention to in a course on modern French history right from the outset. First and foremost, because I am privileged to live on these lands that belong to the peoples I acknowledge. So it's an act of respect and a recognition of a historical past that has been neglected, erased, distorted, and that has real, harmful, even violent legacies in the present. I think as French historians, we're not unfamiliar with those themes and ideas. So there's that. It also sets the tone for the study of the history of France and empire, places most of my students have never been to and may never go to, as a study that might illuminate things about this place where they live. And I draw attention to the seeming out of placeness of a local land acknowledgement by highlighting some of the themes in my courses that are connected to our here and to our now: violent conquest, territorial expansion, dispossession, occupation and displacement, human rights, citizenship, racism, immigration, labor exploitation. The stories that nation states and empires tell about themselves and about Indigenous and colonized peoples. So these are all things that I teach in my courses, and they're all things my students are and or should be thinking about here in this place. So the difference between this place and time and the history of France and empire is also productive, I think. So it's not just about common ground, it's also about the differences, and I use that in my teaching as well. So it isn't just a one-way street of that place, France, illuminating this local place where I happen to work and teach. what my students understand about colonialism's past and present in the spaces that they've either grown up in or immigrated to themselves can also nourish our conversations about France. So I'm happy to say more about various aspects of all this, but I'll just leave it there for now, and maybe we can come back to the Q&A. I don't know if we have the poll results up now, if we can take a look at those. Yeah, so I recently did this poll on Twitter and got, I think, slightly less in terms of the 3 blue categories of people doing some occasions or hearing them or even doing themselves. And that 2% really reflects, I think, a kind of absence of knowledge that we all have even about the territories that our institutions are on, but also thinking about how we might incorporate those things. So I'm gonna leave it off there, but want to come back to some of these questions when we do the Q&A.
So I think that I'm last here, and I guess I'm comforted and reassured in a lot of ways that that so much of what Melissa and Darcie and Roxanne had to say kind of resonates with my approaches to teaching this history as well, and also that I had planned a couple of things to say that are different from what they said, so you're not hearing the same thing again. And what I wanted to, there are kind of 2 things that I think I wanted to say, or 2 points that I wanted to make to open up here. And the first is the maybe kind of counterintuitive thing, given that this is a roundtable on teaching, France in a global frame, is that like this isn't actually a revolutionary thing to do. That the global has been part of the traditional metrocentric narratives of French history for a very long time. I teach modern French history, but you could go back to the textbook that I used when I was an undergraduate in the, Gordon Wright, which is not super imperial in any way, but you can't talk about the French Revolution without talking about the role of imperial warfare and intervention in British affairs in the bankruptcy of the monarchy that caused the crisis of the 1780s. Talking about the Paris Commune or nationalism during the Third Republic means talking about the Franco-Prussian War. Talking about the Vichy regime, you can't do it without talking about German empire building and the Second World War. If we talk about post-war Gaullism, you are also talking about NATO and the European Union and the Cold War. So I was thinking as we were planning for this roundtable about what's different from what the kind of those traditional narratives did, and I think maybe there are 2 things, and the first one is pretty simple, and it's how explicit we make global connections and global themes in our descriptions of what we're doing and the way that we talk about what we're doing with students, whether that's in syllabi, in reading selection, in the presentation in the classroom, and so forth. So it's about sort of making explicit something that might not have been as explicitly named or centered as a key theme previously, that might have been taken for granted. And the other is that some of what Darcie was talking about in what she was aiming for with the textbook, which I think we are all really, really looking forward to getting through review and into our hands, which is expanding kind of what we mean by the global beyond military and diplomatic history into the world of politics, social history, cultural history, and asking questions very explicitly about the role of empire and transnational linkages in political culture and ideology, talking about migration as an essential process in French social history, throughout, talking about race as a critical social category. So these are things that I think, as I think about the way that I have approached teaching French history, both in kind of the survey course, which I teach in 2 pieces, starting like Melissa with the French and Haitian revolutions, and then because I'm a post-revolutionary historian who really likes the 19th century, we spend a whole semester on 1789 to 1870, and then rush through the rest of it in the second semester. But then also in designing specialized courses that really center those issues. So I teach seminars, for instance, on France and its relationship with Algeria from the 18th century to the present. I just taught a new seminar this past spring on immigration, race, and Islam in Paris, focused on the 20th century, which allowed me to kind of make some of this much more explicit. And then the second thing that I wanted to talk about again is something that Darcie brought up, which is that adopting a global frame to me means more than just adding empire. You know, as a colonial historian, I think that's kind of my impulse, is to use the overseas colonies as a proxy or a stand-in for the global. And they're not actually the same thing, but they do coexist and interact. And one of the things that I found really helpful is scholarship that makes that explicit and provides resources that I can either give to students to read, or things that I can steal to write lectures and design, you know, classroom activities with, you know, that involve everything from thinking about how, you know, Napoleon's continental empire was shaped by modes of governance and categories derived from the overseas colonies, which I think is a little bit different than what Melissa was talking about in terms of comparing Italy and Egypt. You know, some of the other things that we talk about are, you know, the ways that 19th century French racial science developed out of an international scientific conversation about race and empire that was not just a European, but also a transatlantic conversation. How post-war Reconstruction was shaped by colonial leaders from Africa and from the Antilles. The you know, sort of proliferation, really fantastic work on the interdependence of decolonization and European integration after the Second World War. And so I think that, you know, these are some of the ways that thinking about the global and talking about the global as more than the imperial, but also as sort of dimensions of a global kind of framework that are connected to each other and interdependent with one another, again, over the long term. So yeah, so those were the two things I wanted to say, and I guess, Melissa, it's back to you.
Thanks. Sorry, I got host muted. Makes it a little tricky. Okay, I think what we'll do, I invite everyone who is watching, listening to again think about ways to, or sort of think about questions that you want to start. We will start with a couple of hours, but I'm happy to start collecting questions. And again, you've got two ways to do this, although both go through the chat function. If you send a chat to HFrance, you can either just give your question or your comment, or you can say that you would actually like to come on screen. We definitely welcome that just as much. And then you'll get a brief identity check, and David will let me know, and we'll invite you on screen as we have a chance. So please start sending us questions and comments. I think you know, we have a list of questions, and there's quite a few that we've already touched on. I think one of the ones that might be useful for us to think a little bit about is a question of how we make room, right? There's this feeling that we're already trying to pack so much into any given semester, right? And so how is it that we actually, like, do you feel like you're giving things up? Do you feel like something has to give in order to really bring this global and imperial angle in and to do it well? I'll actually just throw that out to all of you. I think my answer is the briefest, which is that I started from the beginning this way, and so it kind of made it felt like I was giving up less. I just sort of put it in, but Darcie might feel the same. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I would say is that I think that I think that people have already kind of successfully done this, right? The shifting of the French Revolution to this wider framework of Haitian or Atlantic revolutions is kind of natural now. Discussing colonial soldiers and workers in World War I and World War II, we're already kind of, I think most people I know are kind of doing that. But there's all these other moments that we tend to think of as specifically French or Parisian events, like Haussmannization or 1871, where we can really reach outward. Because like one of the things I often think about with Haussmannization, and when I was writing, to think about urban renewal of Algiers in the Second Empire, or think about the Opera Garnier as the model for the Hanoi Opera House, or in 1871, where we talk about the Paris Commune, why not also talk about the Mokrani Rebellion in Kabylia, insurrections in Martinique, or the deportation of communards to New Caledonia? There's all these moments where you can reach outward from things that we tend to really focus on in the normal kind of metropolitan French history narrative that wouldn't take necessarily a lot of time, but really, I think, broaden outward and show the impact of these kind of specifically French events. Just kind of like one idea, I think, of ways to do that to make the space.
Well, and I think for me, one of the things that's really useful is coming back to that kind of the interdependence and the ways that things that are happening outside of the kind of the continental borders of metropolitan France are actually directly impacting the things that are happening domestically. So you mentioned 1871. You know, I kind of go at it one of the other directions is to talk about actually 1870 and the Franco-Prussian War and the role of troops from Algeria in the mobilization and the final collapse of the Second Empire, so that it goes both ways. The influence, or in 1848, talk about the way that the generals from the Armée d'Afrique are brought in to put down the June Days uprising in Paris. So the kind of the you know. Again, that interdependence of things that are happening inside and outside of France, so that you're actually not choosing.
Yeah.
Waiting, I still don't have any questions. So please, again,
okay.
send some in. What about, I'm sort of looking at, let's maybe go back to this question that I think Roxanne raised, and think about sort of the ways that we connect global and imperial France to the places where we teach, right? And I think we've already talked about the fact that, right, some of it's thematic, right? For me to talk about immigration in Central Texas, living close to a border, right? Like that's a way that I can actually get students to all of a sudden, and there's always these moments where people start to be like, oh, suddenly I'm starting to see some patterns that feel familiar, and they're starting to make me sort of think about what's going on in my life, or what's going on at, you know, the refugee detention center down the road. What about the rest of you?
My students want to talk about race all the time. So I think that has to become kind of a central category in everything we're doing, whether, you know, it is really, they very much want to talk about empire. They want to talk about, they're very interested in because there's so much like connection with the Caribbean. They want to talk about the Haitian Revolution. They want to talk about, you know, just essentially any global influences. So most of the students that I have never been to Europe. They may never go to Europe, right? They're not wealthy kids who get to travel a lot. So for them, Europe, France is kind of a distant, fantastical idea, but being able to connect it to kinds of things that they tend to have some kind of connection to, which is maybe essentially the Caribbean or Africa or other places that their families are from, does seem to have a much more important connection to them in that case.
I brought up land acknowledgement because it's sort of the, you know, a good example of the ways that those connections happen for me. And for me, those connections are also about not just like global or local, I guess, but also about past and present all the time. And that stuff comes up all the time. So while I was teaching this summer class, you know, from May to the end of June, from early May to the end of June, like a global pandemic was happening, obviously. That's why we're doing this way. And then the movement, Black Lives Matter and anti-racism, which took, you know, different forms in different places, including where I live. My students are really interested in American culture and American politics, but they're also kind of interested in what's happening here. And then we were doing a class on French history, so it was kind of a perfect moment to think about global change and resistance and protest and a long history. So all of this is happening while we're also talking about the role that colonial troops played during the Second World War and in the liberation and blanchiment, and like, so for my, and Black Lives Matter meant something to my students in the long haul when we were talking about France in World War II, like they were making those connections pretty easily. So I think making that link, same as Darcie, my students, haven't been to France, most of them, and they probably won't go if they ever do. So seeing the ways that the history that we're doing together or working on together is connected to the kind of politics and culture of this place, but also places nearby, like where you three are in the United States. Yeah, that was hugely effective and productive for discussions, especially these discussions on Zoom. And sometimes people talk about the challenge of getting people to chat. There was no problem with that when we were talking about those things.
We are, I think everybody, we're starting to get some questions fast and furious. So I'm going to start moving into these, and perhaps we'll come back to some of our themes as we move through this. I think, actually, David threw me one. I think this is more just to make a public plea, and if anyone knows anything, feel free to send us a message on this. But the way that we're all talking mostly about the modern era, and the fact that he's saying specifically about a course on absolutism, right? The problem is that as we move further backwards, it's actually harder and harder to find sources, right? Especially sources we can give to students. And I think that's something we struggle with, but we've got a plea out on the table if anyone is looking for new projects for creating a source reader for the 17th century that actually has more of a global framework. So or earlier, I think.
Darcie, do you want to do another one?
Yeah. Darcie, I think we need a prequel.
Yeah.
So, all right. With that being said, we have, I'm going to turn it over to some of the folks who are willing to come on screen. The first of those is Alex Fairfax. We can make that happen. Hello.
Hey.
Oh, there we go. You are unmuted.
Oh yeah, sorry. I was on mute for a minute. Sorry, I'm a little bit. So thank you. Really enjoying what you've been talking about already. I'm at the University of Exeter in the UK. I teach generally 18th century France. I work on the French Revolution. I do the Haitian Revolution connections to kind of thing in my courses a lot. The question I had really was about student experience of all this, because one of the concerns that I always have, and it also I would link it through to the decolonizing the curriculum agenda, is I'm always a bit worried that it makes things very complicated for students, by which I mean that it is very difficult, particularly at undergraduate level now. A lot of students, frankly, don't have a very good understanding of history when they come to university. And it's complicated enough dealing with the outline history of one country, let alone, say, Europe. And then if you throw in the world, I mean, the danger is, particularly for weaker students, that they just end up getting lost. And so I wondered whether any of you have experiences of that and potential strategies for how to mitigate it, because I don't think that's a good enough reason for not doing it, but I would be very interested in hearing any opinions on how you navigate that issue. Thank you.
Maybe I'll jump in here, because I actually just finished this morning writing a piece for H. Diplo about teaching colonialism, and one of the things that I talked about there was how much I have learned from reading what people who are advocates of a pedagogical strategy called uncoverage have to say. And the basic idea of uncoverage is that we actually are not obliged to cover everything. And so we can pick our moments and spend more time on fewer things. That allows us to kind of get at things from different angles. And to give you kind of a specific example, I think one of the things that I realized, I have now been teaching my modern France survey for like 15 years, which means that the course has gotten approximately like 20% longer than it was when I started in terms of the time period that it covers. And so quite simply, I've already had to cut things out to make room for like everything that's happened in France since, 9/11. And so the strategy, or one of the strategies that I rely on increasingly, is to pick case studies or to pick moments that we dig into along multiple thematic or analytical angles. And then we just don't worry about the rest. And the textbook has a bibliography if students want to know more. And so as the instructor, we have the power to decide what we're going to include and what we're not. And that includes the power to leave stuff out.
Sure.
Yeah, I would kind of add on to that. I teach, I think it also depends on the levels that they're at and the kinds of skills. I mean, it gets complicated, and we kind of complain constantly about our students coming in and they have fewer and fewer skills as they're coming in, but a lot of that's complicated too by a variety of factors. But I teach a global history course and have taught world history courses, which are even more complicated. And the thing and this is a survey course for the general ed population. So it's anybody can take it, and they come in with nothing. And what we've also determined in our department is this has to be based solely on primary sources. So there's no textbook, there's no nothing, it's just primary sources. And I also taught it online. It's incredibly complicated to do that. But partly and if you think global history as opposed to world history coverage, it's based around themes. So we can talk about labor, we can talk about industrialization, and we can move through those themes and explore different things without having to assume that everybody's going to cover the entire world and talk about everything. But at least trains them to think about the connections between different parts of the world and to think about these connections as opposed to necessarily just gaining content knowledge. And I think that's partly what I'm interested in, is about how do I train them to think about ways of gaining knowledge as opposed to just gaining the content knowledge. So for me, that's much more important than just knowing everything about the history of a country from the 18th century to the present, because they're going to forget it. I forget things as soon as it goes into my brain. But instead, how can we train them to want to explore more, to know how to do it, and then to think about the connections between these different themes. And hopefully they'll use that and explore courses further, maybe go on to higher degrees, who knows. But
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
I wanted to just, one of the questions that just came in almost dovetails with Darcie's answer, and it was partly addressed to her. This is from Mark Myers. He had said that that the challenge of writing a textbook, as Darcie has, that has all of these inclusions in it, and was asking just this question: are there themes like migration, which you just mentioned, or modernity that sort of help this? And I think I'll ask her to speak to it, but I would say I think that's a big part in an answer to Alex, right? That's a big part of how we do this kind of work. I think this gets at, how do we make it relevant to our students in general, right? Like, why do they care about French history? And it's a question we get a lot. And so I think by using these themes, right, like saying, hey, we're going to talk about race is at this point in time something that a lot of my students are desperate to talk about, and finding new ways to do that I think is really useful. So I don't know, were there other, I think modernity, migration are some of the suggestions from Mark, but were there other kind of thematic organizing or sort of underpinnings for the textbook, Darcie?
Those are some of them. I haven't actually explicitly laid out very clear themes. However, each chapter is kind of organized around a cultural object, depending on what it is. It might be like, I'll just say the Second Empire. I start with Zola and the belly of Paris, and thinking about how something like that organizes, right? We have this character who's coming back from, it was like Guyana, and coming back into Paris in the middle of the Haussmannization after being exiled into a prison colony. What does that mean? something like that. So there's always something like that framing each chapter, but it's not necessarily things that frame the entire book. But as we're moving through, there's things like that. But yeah.
Well, I'll ask Roxanne and Jennifer maybe to take this on, but I am also going to ask our host to launch our third poll, which is actually asking you all what sorts of textbooks that you're using for your French history classes. So if you could launch that poll while Jennifer and Roxanne maybe talk. There we go. And Jennifer and Roxanne can also, while they answer, give us a sense of maybe some themes that they're using.
You want to go ahead, Jennifer?
Sure. I mean, I think again, Darcie mentioned teaching world history. At my previous institution, I developed a new gen ed level, the world since 1200. Let me tell you, that was clarifying about like making decisions about what matters and what I cared about and what I wanted to achieve. And so actually kind of bringing that experience back to sort of redesigning some of my French history classes has actually made me much more explicit about the themes that we're following. And so I have chosen sort of political culture and definitions of rights and practices of politics, women and gender, race and empire, and migration, and kind of transnational connection. And, you know, it turns out that actually covers quite a bit of ground and leaves a lot of flexibility. But it's really helpful to be able to kind of articulate those at the beginning, and then as they come up to point to them and say, okay, remember how we talked about this when we were talking about the revolution. Well, now it's coming back at the beginning of the Third Republic, or it's coming back again as we're writing the Constitution for the Fifth Republic, or, you know, fighting about headscarves in the 1980s, whatever it might be. And you can talk about how they relate to each other. So I think, you know, sort of having a name for it is really helpful. Maybe actually going back to Alex Fairfax's question, for students especially who maybe not have a very strong background in history, being able to label and name things is really helpful for them.
Go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say that, well, speaking more to the French history part of this, but it's actually also true when I think about it in my European survey, like the reigning questions of both of those courses that I teach that are surveys, you know, just swap out Europe for France is like, what even is France? Like what do we think it is? Like when we start, and then my students are like, France is a place where people speak French. And I'm like, sometimes, you know, or France is a place where people are Christian. Well, you know, or France is a place in Europe, not always, you know, or just even the idea that France is always an empire, always has been, always will be, probably still is now. So to think about, I think starting in that way is really helpful for my students. So, I mean, to come back to what Alex had asked about, like not trying to establish some more traditional framework for understanding French history and then trying to mess with it, but just starting with this place is not actually a thing. It's a changing historical set of concepts. Yes, it's a geographic space, but that's always changing. Yes, it's languages, but that's always changing. Yes, it's political. Like, so then my students stop chasing the history of this thing called France, and then the object of the course becomes like, how have people just argued about what it is for, in my case, for more than 200 years, because I teach starting in the 18th century. But so yeah, I just wanted to add that to the mix, is we just start that way so nobody feels like, and my students don't know or care about France at all, most of them, so they don't feel disappointed. I mean, they sometimes feel disappointed that we don't talk about Napoleon, but Napoleon is great for this. I'm like, and look, still an empire, more of an empire, a little bit less of an empire. So, yeah.
I'm going to ask our textbook results just to pop up just so we can see those. But in terms of like naming things, one thing I think that we're all starting to do, I'm not sure we're going to have a full discussion just devoted to this, but one of the themes we had discussed together is the ways that that teaching French history this way actually helps us to bring France into our other class. I only get to teach one French history class in my like 10 course rotation, right? So this is really how, this is where my like world history class also like fits in. All right, we've got, a lot of people don't even use textbooks. That's kind of awesome. I try not to. This is one of the few classes I do. Great. Also, we have those results up there for you. Any last thoughts on sort of these? I think I wasn't sure. Darcie, did you have something to say on this before we moved on?
No, I mean, as somebody who also doesn't use a textbook for my own class, great.
Even as you write one. All right.
As I'm writing one, yeah.
All right, we have a question from Tip Reagan. I think if we can get that pulled up.
Hello, I just had to change positions because I had the light in the wrong place.
Hi.
Hi, I love this panel. I've been looking forward to it so long. My buddies on it, and I just find it so provocative and interesting. So thank you. And Roxanne, I'm really looking forward to your upcoming, your other one presentation. And actually, I know that Darcie, you too. This is just great. It's a great conference. And my question, in a way, actually not in a way, my question follows really on the feet of this discussion. And I was wondering, and it's kind of a kind of embarrassed to ask it as the director of the Society for French Historical Studies, because I'm going to tell you that at Colorado College, I pretty much never teach a class on French history. I think that I'm actually teaching a course on the French Revolution for the first time this year, but almost all of my classes are, I wouldn't put them in the category of world history, but they are topical courses on things like history of sex traditions, or history of sex modernity, or history of witchcraft. My colleague Carol Neal, who does medieval history and is giving a paper at this conference, she does a course on children and the family, or prisons and incarceration. And I was just wondering if you could, I'm going to get to the topic here under investigation here. If you've talked a little bit about how it's important, for example, in responding to Alex, the importance of having certain kinds of themes that would come up. And I really appreciate that. I'm wondering about the relative pluses and minuses of how you actually frame the course from the very get-go, and what the political and moral outcomes that you hope will come out of them are. So Roxanne, you were getting to this too right at the end. So I guess I would like us to be a little bit more explicit though. So if you teach a course on, let's say, housemanization and how, and look at how there are certain kinds of forms of urban renewal that take place in places, you know, like in Algiers or in other parts of the world, in a way, you're still foregrounding France. I mean, even your questions that you put up on the board, you said something like, well, in your French history courses, blah, 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 blah. Well, I don't teach a French history course. So we're still, I'm wondering, like, what's the good of foregrounding France? And I think there are good things, but what are the costs? And what would be the benefits of provincializing France further by virtue of teaching a class that would be on, like, history of incarceration, in which you would bring in French examples and examples from Indochina and other places. Sometimes there would be transnational conversations and transmissions of knowledge and production knowledge in both directions, sometimes not. But then also, like when I think about a course, would I do a course on the French and Haitian revolutions, or a course, I know it sounds in some ways kind of very old-fashioned, but a course on revolution? And then you have the Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution. What are the points of connection? What are not the points? But I think that there are political and pedagogical implications in how you situate things, even in the title of the course, and how you frame it just from the beginning. So do you see what I mean? Like, if we could be a little bit more explicit just in evaluating the plus and minus. I don't want to say that one is, like, doing what I'm doing when I'm not teaching French history is better, because I think there are costs that takes place there. But I think to be explicit about the cost and benefits would be a really good thing too.
Yeah, I will jump in because I don't teach French history anymore, actually. I'll just kind of say that. My students are not really interested in it so much, the course, and we're also shifting our entire curriculum in my department away from geographically oriented nation state courses. So are doing much more thematic courses. Like we will do something on like the history of incarceration that will be like this. So I'm very grateful for your question that kind of, and we had already kind of been interested in talking about this. How can we use French history and French Empire in our other courses? So I think that this isn't a very important question. Like how can we take our knowledge and pedagogical uses of our what had been kind of standard French history courses and apply them to other kinds of courses. And I think that there is a lot of use for this. And I think that's the Revolutions course is a perfect example. And I teach a course, the course that I think is most relevant for my case is I teach a course on decolonization, which is a lot of Algeria, but there's tons of, Indochina, and we talk about counterinsurgency, and then also a lot of Africa. So I think there's great applications for all the things that we're doing in any different kinds of courses. And in terms of, Haussmannization, you could teach a great global history on urban renewal. And I think there's been a lot of work that's been done on that already, looking at comparative examples and pull in the French cases, but also look at the empire that's been happening throughout that. So yeah, I'll just kind of stop there because I'm sure everyone else has things to say, but I think it's a very important question, and there's a lot of potential to use French history in these ways.
I have sort of a funny story, which my first sort of entry into the job market, I had like all of these great ideas for all of these classes I wanted to teach, and I actually had a member of a search committee be like, "Can you teach a class on French history?" I mean, yeah, but like that's what you want, really? I was like trying to pitch this. Actually, it was a global cities course, so I was so again, that's one of the reasons I started my remarks, saying that some of us are going to be in places where that's more welcome and supported than others. So I do a human rights seminar, and so pulling in discussions of rights from whether it's the French Enlightenment tradition or whether it's the critiques of it. I use my world history class is on nations and nationalism, and one of our case studies, I will put in another plug here for sometimes case studies are just a super useful way to move, to figure out how to give students a handle on things that are really complex and can blow out. But if we have these sort of sets of case studies, they can really work with it. And right now I use Algeria, and part of it's, this is my one sort of class, this is none of my classes actually have prerequisites, but this is one of the ones that's most open. And I'm like, okay, everyone at some point in their undergraduate career should probably watch Battle of Algiers, and they should probably read France Fanon. And like, let's do this, right? This is where I'm going to make this happen. And so I think that's, those are, I guess, some of the places that I use this. My co-panelists.
I mean, maybe I can weigh in here a little bit. I think, I had also gotten to a point where just curricular needs at my previous institution meant that I was teaching Western Civ to 300 students, like, every year. I didn't teach the French history survey for basically from the time I got tenure. But so what I actually think is kind of a luxury of my new job is that I have been able to go back to teaching French history because there are a bunch of other Europeanists who teach other things too. And I hear you about the thematic courses, Tip, and I think that is a direction that, like, certainly my department is moving with thinking about curriculum. But I have found that particularly when you think about teaching France in this kind of global imperial perspective, that France can actually serve to provincialize other places, and particularly American history. So teaching revolutionary France and the Haitian Revolution, particularly together, but thinking even, sort of the long French Revolution that doesn't end until 1884 or whatever, at Mr. Jefferson's university, this gives a very different idea about what the Age of Revolutions is all about. Teaching, this seminar in Immigration, Race, and Islam in Paris, there's actually, there's really fantastic, readings that are explicitly comparative about how race operates in France and the United States, sort of the two sister republics that have very different ideas about cultural, religious, racial, and ethnic diversity. And so actually, I think for my students, teaching French history was a way for them to get a very different perspective on and American history that they were much more familiar with.
Roxanne, do you have anything?
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right, then we have another question in person from Lynn Sharp. Hi, Lynn.
Hi. Can you hear me? So my question is kind of oddly personal. It's about the land acknowledgements. And I teach at Whitman College, which is definitely a place that was stolen directly and by force from the peoples who lived here. And we're repairing our relationship with the Confederated Tribes. But I am a person who is not just a settler, but a colonist by my background. You know, I have the whole white pedigree of America. Somebody came over in the Mayflower, somebody signed the Declaration of Independence, somebody fought in the Revolutionary War, right? I mean, it's all my fault, right? And I'm sure I'm not alone here in this. And so I'm interested in whether you think it is more or less productive for me. I'm not going to deny that part, but is it useful for me to sort of set out my own personal history? Or is it more important to talk about space and place and how we're all, you know, part of this? Because I've sort of gone back and forth.
It's so interesting that you say that you bring this up, Lynn, because like, of course, I'm an immigrant, I'm a person of color, and the last month or so has been an interesting time because I am simultaneously, as like a brown woman who lives in this place, well, in any place that's not full of brown people, like a privileged person and, you know, what people in Canada often call a visible minority. And I just like move back and forth all the time. It's a little exhausting. So I actually have had this experience being here of going from a place where I had no knowledge of my privilege as a settler, even as the kid of immigrant parents, and more of a sense of like, is Canada fair to me because I'm a brown person, like more of that. And then I move here and I go back and forth between those two things all the time. And then especially in the last several weeks, you know, yes, I'm a person of color, but I'm not a Black person. And so what the politics of race are for my relationship to anti-racism and anti-Blackness, totally different. And so for me anyway, I think rather than focusing on like my specific circumstances in relationship to all these possible forms of privilege, with the land acknowledgement at least, it's like about recognizing this history. It's about not erasing it. It's about not being quiet about it. It's about drawing attention to it. And it's also about doing it in a meaningful way. And I'm not gonna lie, sometimes I do it in a way that's like quick, I'm giving it, you know, there's a talk, I'm in Melissa's role or whatever, and that's what I'm doing. There isn't a lot of time for me to go on and on about my connection to making the acknowledgement like I'm doing here. In my classes, I take the time because I think it's worth it. And I do sometimes talk about myself. I think if I were in a class or a room full of Indigenous people, I would probably speak less about my own relationship to to settler colonialism or to immigration. If I'm in a room full of white students, which is usually the room that I'm in, I feel like I can say more about being a person of color who teaches French history and how I don't really work on race and isn't that weird, you know, like that sort of stuff. So I don't know if that helps, but I think it's okay to talk about your own relationship to these things. I think it's important, but for me, the focus is always on like, what are the histories that have been excluded and downplayed? And in your case, I mean, I don't know, I don't teach American in the United States, but like people know that story or at least know some version of it. So yeah, I don't know what other people think about all that.
I mean, one of the things that's really struck me moving to Virginia is how in kind of American discourse, and I actually think reading a lot of what sort of the events in France over the last couple of months as well, that you know, race operates, at least in public discourse, very differently in different parts of the world. And so, you know, Central Virginia is a place where, you know, sort of the reckoning with the history of slavery and segregation and white supremacy is very explicit, and it is, you know, it is literally on the public square, you know, guys with guns every day. And my students are very, very aware of that. What is not talked about is settler colonialism. So I went looking for a land acknowledgement for UVA in advance of this, and we don't have one. Like, if you go to Monticello, there is now a whole kind of explanatory discussion about the history of slavery and Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings and so forth. You stand in the vestibule, which is papered, wallpapered, floor to ceiling with material from the Lewis and Clark expedition. And there is not one word about, you know, the Louisiana Purchase as an act of settler colonialism. And so this is something that I think I've been very conscious of, in addition to the kind of my personal positionality. And that's another place where teaching French history, and actually do this more explicitly in a course I teach on modern European imperialism, that is a thematic comparative course, is to use that as a way to get students to think about the structures of settler colonialism in a way that gives them a little bit of emotional distance from their own subjectivity, and then I hopefully allows them to come back to the American situation and their local context with new perspective, and to recognize and see things that they didn't see previously.
I think I'm going to ask, just because I know this question is going to pick up, I think, where Jen just left off. I think we have a question from Josh Cole about comparisons.
Hi, can you hear me? Thanks very much for this. This is really terrific and inspiring. I've learned an enormous amount just sitting and listening and thinking about. Well, I've been teaching a kind of global France course now for more than 2 decades, and actually much more than 2 decades. So in some ways, the question I had at first was a question about how our problem here, how to think about teaching France in a global context or teaching the globe in a French context, poses questions for the narratives we use to hold our class together. That's also a question for textbook authors too, because narrative is part of what we struggle with. And you know, Tip's question, where he suggested that there might really be a kind of moral or political imperative to let go of a national historiography because of the damage that those national historiographies has done in the past. And to seek other ways of organizing is a very powerful argument. And I think we need those kinds of classes. You know, we need a class on racial capitalism. We need a class on settler colonialism. We need a class on you know, incarceration in a global context. All those things are good. I want to support Jennifer's suggestion, though, that there is a way of teaching national historiographies that's not essentialist, right? That doesn't reproduce a triumphant story, but in fact can draw attention to the ways in which narrating the nation is precisely what's at stake at almost every moment in these histories. And so narration becomes not your main overarching task, but in fact part of what you draw the students' attention to. Right. So when I teach, I teach a global France class, and it is a class that is really sort of centered on place, on France and both its European and its overseas spaces. But it's chronological. You know, it starts in the late 18th century. I actually I broke it up into two halves. It's now a 2-semester sequence. So the first semester goes from about 1750 to the Commune, and the second one basically starts with the Dreyfus Fair and goes to the present. But a lot of what we talk about is the way that the primary sources that we have narrate the questions about national identity and citizenship and belonging. So and that actually leads me to break the chronology at some points. When I teach 1830 in the invasion of Algeria, I actually, for the first half, I'll assign Assia Jabbar. So we'll read the Fantasia, we'll read that, and it means that I actually have to give a lecture about the Algerian War in the middle of everything, because the book goes back and forth. But the way in which she tells the story about the 19th century brings in all of these things, and it kind of works. But now I'll circle back. Sorry I went on for so long. But the way that my class breaks down is that I have a really hard time, because of my national framework, I have a really hard time with bringing in the ways that, the story of labor in the colonial context is similar to the struggles about labor in other parts of the world at the same time. So end of the 19th century, early 20th century, struggles about labor, struggles about the racialization of labor practices and coercion. That part is really hard for me. And if anybody has sort of advice for somebody who has not yet given up a chronological structure centered around French spaces, for bringing in broader narratives like racial capitalism, for example, I'd really appreciate it, because that's what I struggle with. It's where I lose the students, right? If I bring in something, if I suddenly I'm talking about Reconstruction after the Civil War, I just lose people. Okay, I'll stop. I'm done.
Well, I don't know how to do that. I think one of the things I always remind myself, and this has kind of come up once or twice in different versions, like not every class does everything. And so I think that's one piece of, and sometimes what I've tried to become more and more conscious about is, and this maybe even gets back to Alex's initial question about, what about the students who get lost really easily? You kind of are working at different levels, and you want to throw those things out there. So maybe you talk about the fact that, right, okay, there's a whole, history of international, forced labor practices. Hey, my colleague teaches this class on this. By the way, if you're interested, right, go take this, or, come talk to me if you want some additional readings. So it sort of depends, right? Some of those are things that need to be almost, I don't want to say throwaway lines, right? But they're sort of these one-offs. Like, there's one student sitting in that corner of my room who I know, I guess they'll be in my Zoom now, but who I know is like really interested in this one thing, and I'll maybe sort of throw something out to them and be able to have a conversation afterwards. So it's like a placeholder for them for that conversation later. And then there are some things where you're like, you know what, I think if we're really going to get into this and the way students are talking about this, I think I actually need to go find a piece that is one of these more sort of comparative pieces that actually talks about it, right? So that's when you go and you find the person who did, comparative urban renewal strategies in a way that your students have enough that they can latch into the French part and then start to see kind of the connections out. That helps. Who else has?
I don't know if I have advice for you, Josh. I definitely don't have advice for you, but I was thinking about, when you were talking, I was thinking about the fact that when I think about all the survey courses that I teach, and maybe it's also, and this, I mean, you have to ask my students, this is either like a good thing or a terrible, terrible thing, is that like most of the classes I teach are methods and theory classes, and then sometimes I get to teach French history. So like the idea of narrative as a thing that nation states do, like I think I said it earlier, the stories that nation states and empires tell about themselves, like that's the reason we're doing the class. And that's the thread that runs throughout really everything I teach. I think I'm a one-trick pony that way. So like in the Modern French Survey, like the balance between, I use all kinds of things, all kinds of maps, all kinds of timelines, all kinds of like those traditional tools that structure and teach people stories, you know, the ones that I had as a student. But at every turn, like the first day of class in my modern French survey, I give them a sheet of paper with a line like running horizontally, like in landscape, you know, mode. And it says 1789 at the beginning and a few dots before it. And then it has whatever year I happen to be teaching in at the other end. And it has nothing else on it. And like, that's how we start. Like, there is a timeline, there is a story. And then the students put in what they already know or think they know. And then we talk about that. And so that's like the first day of class. So we're always talking about how stories are made, which stories are told, how some stories beat up other stories or suppress other stories, how they, you know, come back to haunt the nation or whatever. So I think in terms of that idea of narrative, it's like I go back and forth between the structure and the timeline and the chronology, because I think my students kind of like that and we move through it, but we're always like rattling it and asking questions about it. And then by the end of the class, they kind of look at that thing and they have totally different things to put on it or don't see it the same way. So I just think that idea of narrative is so compelling to me as a question. So instead of having a theme in my class, I would say that if I have a theme, every class I have is structured around a question, not necessarily like a statement, if that makes any sense.
Mm. Yeah, and same. I don't have advice except that the only thing, my students don't read, so like the only thing that I can find that compels them are very interesting sources. So I spend like the vast majority of my time just like desperately trying to find interesting sources for them. So, which is why I don't end up using textbooks most of the time. And I'm trying to find like primary sources in particular that make these connections. So if there's just like something outside maybe France, but that connects with that, or I don't even know, but just that seems to be the only thing that kind of draws them back in sometimes. I don't know. It's hard. It's very hard.
I think I don't think we have any other sort of on-screen questions, but we've had sort of a set of questions in the chat box that have come over that I think kind of feed off on this. And that's a set of questions actually asking about resources and about pedagogical approaches that really work well for this. I'll sort of put that as the main theme and see if I can grab a couple of these in here. We have someone asking about, you know, the fact that I think, and I do think we just sort of left this out, right, but ecological and environmental history, and whether there are sources and approaches from that can help us with this. Some questions about specific ways to get, to talk about French race and French whiteness. And then some other questions, again, more broad questions about what it means to move past republicanism. I think that one was specifically Darcie was the one who raised that. You know, are there models and counter models, right? What are we looking for and what are we, you know, trying to recreate? I know I didn't take a French history course as an undergraduate. I think that was something else, right? And it's like, or I took very specific, right? I took a class on like 1848 and I took a class on you know, French nationalism, but that was not like when I had to teach a survey, I was like, I don't even know what this looks like, and sort of had to beat that. So in some ways I didn't have the model there. I think I started taking a lot of notes at conferences was one of the things that I did, and started pulling all of those onto my syllabi, the people who said things that were really interesting. But yeah, so anyone else, some sort of particular pedagogical approaches that you find useful, or sets of sources, types of things that you want to sort of throw out there?
Can I just, Melissa, just say this might be a good time to share this link to the Google Doc that we started, but is by no means a complete, I think our host, so not Melissa, but our behind
I'm putting the request now.
have the link, and it's really just to start. Like, I put on something that I would really hope that everybody would at least experiment with. It's a global map. It's produced in Canada, but it's called nativeland.ca, and it's a global map that basically shows you, it's sort of like a crowdsourced and like open source project where they collect information from all over the world about Indigenous land, and you can find out where you are and correct them if they're wrong. And so yeah, it's quite an amazing interactive tool, but there's other things on there as well. And so I just wanted to mention it here while people are talking about resources, but also I've made it just a Google Doc that's there as a link that anybody can access. So if you all have, like audience members, if you all have things that you want to share with other people or with just, you know, the panel, that you can add to that document, any links, any sources, you know, they also don't have to be online sources, but you know, that's our jam right now.
The doc is in your chat box now if you have not.
Yeah, so the Google Doc has all those things on it. Yeah. And feel free to add.
Well, I think, I mean, I might say, I think you know, certainly the ecological environmental question is an important one, and, you know, probably none of us happens to be an environmental historian, so maybe Chris Church is the person to ask, I don't know. But I guess I would say a couple of things. You know, when we were talking about sources, one of the people, in terms of race and whiteness, I think one of the things that, you know, as French historians, we might recognize is that our colleagues in other social sciences are far ahead of us on some of these questions. And so the most useful things that I have found on race, and particularly on whiteness, are being written by sociologists and anthropologists rather than historians, and that anybody who is not reading Jean Beeman's work on whiteness is missing the boat. So that worked really well with my students. And she's got, you know, a bunch of articles in a bunch of different formats that can be very useful, I think, in a variety of different contexts. But on the getting past republicanism, this is like a hobby horse of mine as somebody who started off working on the much maligned July monarchy. That, you know, France has been a republic for far less time than it has been like many other things. And so the tyranny of republicanism is something to be torn down along with the rest of the tyrants. And actually, like, monuments and commemoration, I have found a really useful way to do that, particularly in Charlottesville, where monuments are a big kind of pressing local question, and I think now for all of us, in a lot of places, that actually looking at the monuments that get put up and taken down and how people feel about them over time is actually a really good reminder of the diversity of political organization in France and of the kinds of political ideologies that you know, last a lot longer sometimes than the regimes that that embodied them as well. So I would make a plug for that, which is another kind of useful way to get around some of the issues about sources and language, because visual materials are you know, very accessible.
We are getting very close to our time. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I want to end with a couple of plugs. Roxanne, do you want to say something about the Western event coming up?
Yes, I do. I also just want to say that as somebody who works on nuclear testing, like, you can't do nuclear testing. Like, I'm not an environmental historian. I would never say that I am, but it's like you can't avoid Indigenous history or in the history of the environment. And it's very, unfortunately, a global history without even trying. So yeah, on Monday, July 20th, there is, and it's in the Google Doc, the link for the event, the Western Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee. We've organized a roundtable event on equity and solidarity in the times of COVID with 4 amazing panelists. I won't go on and on about it, but please check out the link in the Google Doc that I sent around. There's still space. It's happening July 20th at, now I'm thinking in French time, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So whatever that is, wherever you are on this planet. And it's free and it's open to the public. You don't have to be a French historian and you don't have to be a member of the Western. You just can attend by registering at the link that's in that Google Doc. Wasn't there another event that we wanted to?
Yeah, we were also going to say there are two events left on Thursdays. It's lunchtime for me. I think it's 12:30 Eastern New York time, but it's the Unsilenced Past, and that link is also in
that's in the Google Doc too.
And also, I just want to say thank you very much to the New Zealand organizers and to David for making all of this possible. Yeah. It's really amazing that you've managed to put this together. Such a fabulous conference, even though we're not all together in New Zealand, sadly.
Absolutely.
I was going to say that I hope this really, like I said, this was conceived as something that was just supposed to launch a conversation, and thank those of you who've participated and those of you who've been listening, and I really hope we all get to talk to all of you much more in either virtual or real spaces as soon as possible. But it is now 5:31, so, well, sorry, on my clock, wherever you are. It's been an hour and a half since we started talking, and I hope all of you are having sort of safe and healthy time, and definitely check out all the resources. We'll make sure I've seen a bunch of things coming through in the chat as well. We'll make sure that those get listed. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.